new Scramble for Africa. My name is Dan Poulton. I'm a journalist, filmmaker and activist. I'm a member of Counterfire, which is hosting today's meeting. Before I introduce my film, I'm just going to talk you through the agenda, copies of which are at the back if you're interested. I'm going to do say a few words by way of introduction to the film, but in a way the film is the introduction to today's session, so I won't say too much beforehand. The film will run for about 50 minutes, and then myself and Explo Nani Kofi, who appears in the film, and May El-Haj, who's also in the film, will be taking part in a Q&A. May will be chairing that session today, and we'll just have a questions and contribution session for about half an hour, and then we'll break for lunch, which will be at about 10 to 3, 20 to 10 to 3. And after lunch, at around about 25, half past 3, keep it rather formal, so do bear with us, informal. We're going to have a screening of John Rees' film on South Africa's struggle for freedom, which is part of a series that he made for the Islam Channel. The timeline, the scripts of which have been turned into a book and are on sale. If you're interested in purchasing that, it's recommended. And then we'll have a 20-30 minute Q&A with John on the significance of that struggle, that liberation struggle and its implications today. That will basically take us through the day. That is my phone.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'll switch.
So yes, please, they do that in the cinema, don't they? It's locked in.
Yeah.
So it's not normally someone ringing. So if you could put your phones on airplane mode or stealth mode, whatever it's called, that'd be great. Okay, so I just want to introduce the film briefly. It's a film that I made recently for the Islam Channel. It's something that has been on my mind to do, and we've been discussing for quite a while actually. Certainly for long before the invasion of Mali began. It was very much, I think, a military incursion that was out of the blue, that was unexpected to lots of people, caught a lot of people off guard. It seems quite clear that, in a sense, we're past the stage of conspiracy theories here, because actually we're in a stage, I think, and this is what the film tries to sort of tease out, where the strategy of the Western powers in regard to Africa and its relationship to the ongoing war on terror that has dominated this first decade and a half of this century. Their motives and their strategies are probably more obvious, more overt than they have been for a long time. You know, you have a situation when you have, for example, the Financial Times running an article called "The New Scramble for Africa," which quotes a guy called Richard Gush, who's a senior figure in Merrill Lynch Bank of America that have significant African dealings. He says "The New Scramble for Africa" is underway. You have Leon Panetta saying that the war on terror continues, which is quite interesting because if you look at what Obama said in 2009 when he tried to dial down the war on terror. He tried to say it's not a war on terror, it's a war against Al-Qaeda and its affiliates, and and so on. Actually, and despite him saying that a decade of war is now ending in his inaugural speech, the actions of the US and the Western powers and NATO and the EU have proved that not to be the case. And you have Leon Panetta saying the war on terrorism continues. So this is very much, I see it as a new phase in the war on terror, which is what the film tries to grapple with. It's only about 50 minutes, and it could be 5 hours, but maybe that would bore you. I don't know. But the point is, there are lots of things that I've tried to relate the film as much as I can to the immediate situation in terms of Mali and the general strategy of the West. There are lots of questions that remain, and the discussion perhaps would be good to tease those out. For example, what is the strategic significance of China in Africa? That's only really touched on in the film. What kind of resistance to these wars are we going to see? That's only briefly touched on in the film, and other issues like this. So I'm going to run the film, and then we're going to go straight into the Q&A. And any questions you have, we can, or contributions you want to make, we can deal with in that session. So yeah, as I say, thank you for coming today, and let's get this thing on. One of the things that's quite striking is that historically African states, heads of states, have collaborated with the West in terms of this. They ushered in the French airstrikes. So there's a profound disconnect between the heads of state in the country and their people, and I think that's a fundamental contradiction. And I don't think, what we're probably going to see, we'll probably hear a lot of talk like this, because, not what you're saying, but in terms of how people present the solutions, because, AFRICOM is presenting itself as that we just want to help guys, like we can train you, we've got lots of experience in failed wars in big continents, whatever their pitch is. But that's, they're trying to insinuate themselves into the social political structures of the region. So I think the people of, to pick up the point at the back as well, the people of the region need to be wary of their leaders in that sense, because they will be selling them out in a big way for these kinds of interests. So I think there is a danger that you sort of get this turn towards the militarization of Africa, in the sense that it's pitched as a kind of, well, Africa needs to support itself, Africa needs to be independent, and therefore these states become militarized states that use that militarization to crack down on their people. So I think really the kind of transformative solutions have to come from below, they have to come from the populations. I mean, it's something that's picked up on the film that Explo mentioned. I'm sure he can go into this in much more details. But in fact, if you look at the early stage, the post-colonial era in Africa after the 1960s, when you did have democracy, popular democracy, often quite left-wing governments, and not wanting to sort of romanticize those governments, but they were, there was a democratic will for independence and so on. That was squashed by the Western powers. As shown in the film, you had Jacques Chirac saying, that democracy was a luxury. The multi-party systems was a luxury. He was in favour of one-party states in most of Africa. So we're now at a stage where democracy, the name of democracy and its function, has been so degraded and devalued over the last 30 years that actually now the Western states can, for themselves, talk relatively safely about they can say democracy this, democracy that, we voted in this government, we voted in that, look, it was a ballot box, it's all cool guys. They can sort of do that because the sort of democracy that they install is not anything like the kind of democracy you saw emerging in the 1960s that was quite deliberately crushed, bloodily crushed by America. And just finally about the economic involvement, I mean, I've just Googled it. 5 best companies in Africa 2012, according to some market website. They're mainly obscure, Orascom, mobile phone operator, MTM is a cellular network group. Standard Bank, goes on, it's oil, Sonatrach, oil, gas. So the minerals thing, resources thing, like the original Scramble for Africa, so I'm scrambling my words, was, that was about resources, and it's about resources now. And just finally, on China, what China's doing, their strategy, quite simple. They are building infrastructure in Africa in exchange for cut-rate deals on resources. It's not because they just love to see ordinary Africans texting each other, to make their lives better. It's not because they don't have a military sort of vision. They're using their economic strength as opposed to their weak military strength. And America's doing exactly the inverse. It's using its strong military strength in balance for its weak economic strength. So that's why China and America come into it from very different sort of angles. But it's still, I would say, an imperialist carve-up.
Yeah, first let me take the liberty to announce 2 events, anti-war events coming, where I'm sure there'll be a lot of discussion about Mali, Algeria, First one is, I think, North London anti-war meeting, where we have Jeremy Corbyn, Lindsay Jema, Hakim Adi, I saw here, Sami Ramadan is speaking, at Old Fire Station, 84 Maton Street, London N7. I don't know whether anyone has leaflets at the back, but there's one leaflet here. And on Saturday, at the School of Oriental African Studies, SOAS, Kalele Lecture Theatre, being organized by Algeria Solidarity Committee. There's also going to be a meeting there on the situation in Mali and Algeria. I think it's at 4:30 p.m. Kalele Lecture Theatre. So you can put that down, so I will be able to continue the discussion from there. How many people here have read the book How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney? In that book, it's said that when the first European adventurers came down, the traditional rulers in Africa were negotiating for cooperation, not domination. But Europe, these adventurers refused to accept cooperation and rather decided to come with domination. So the Africans approached them with peace. They welcomed them peacefully, discussed with them how we could cooperate, because Africa has not always been less developed as the rest of the world. It's the situation we have, the gap between Africa and the rest of the world today didn't exist long ago. So the rulers in Africa, the chiefs, were in a position those days to even negotiate, let's cooperate so that we can build a better world for all of us. We all share the world of this world. You see, in Africa, as I said in the film, it is the Western intervention which makes the rocks who rule Africa stronger than the grassroots forces. It is not that the only people we have are these idiots. There are people struggling in various ways. And the fact is that when you look at the condition of Africa, the people are more likely to be receptive to revolutionary ideas, because revolutionary ideas to change the world means that we close the gap between the countries which have developed very far and live in Africa behind. So Africans will not normally be fighting to sustain the kind of condition which makes them worse off, so that people even do not feel like living in those countries. So without the West being on the side of the forces which use money in elections, the forces which have arms to destroy groups which are struggling in the interest of people, the forces which imprison people who lead struggles against the IMF, the World Bank, and all these multinationals. So if we can have a way in which we can strengthen the forces fighting below from all across Africa, and the social movements all across the African continent, and find a way of pressurizing the West to get out of this, to stop supporting these other figures. I like going back to history all the time, because when the process of the struggle for African independence was going on the African continent, they made two pillars. And that's one reason why I don't separate the Maghreb from Africa south of the Sahara. Because the Casablanca group, which had progressive forces in it, which prepared the ground for the All Africa People's Conferences, had both Maghreb countries and countries like Ghana, Guinea, Mali, Tanzania in there. So, but the West again intervened, got Tafawa Balewa in Nigeria and other forces, helped send money in to create this Morovia group, and created a lot of problem until the time that the OU was formed. So it isn't that the forces that control Africa today are stronger than the more radical forces, but because of the advantage which they have been given by the West. That is why people in this Western country will have to pressurize their governments to stop being involved in the politics of Africa. So to ask how to solve the problem is how we can build strong solidarity for the pro-people forces in Africa, because they exist. But I have come from Africa. I'm living in Africa now. I left Africa earlier on precisely because of the fact I was campaigning against the IMF and the World Bank and had to escape death. And if we are able to build solidarity, maybe to the level of the solidarity we had during the anti-apartheid movement, we will be able to strengthen these grassroots forces, to unite, and they being visible, it will not be easy for the forces which have decided to collude with Europe to have our resources being taken out. With regards to China, many left forums when I go, they talk about China having given better conditions and all that. But my friend from Ghana will tell you, China is too much involved in illegal mining activities in Ghana. Chinese are found with arms in villages involved. These are the kind of activities our people were involved in the past and were being arrested. Now the Chinese have gone into villages and they are in the forefront leading this illegal mining, and it has become a major area of Chinese operation in Ghana, where I live. And so we need to expose. There are some forums where when you are critical of China, and left forums in this place, where you are critical of China, I don't know, you might not even be able to get out of the room. But clearly, they have to listen to the experience of Africans and what they are seeing in their countries. I think that making facts available so that the solidarity movement is well armed with these facts might help. I know that yes, the US has such massive arms and all that, but I think that people's power can make a change. They did have more massive arms than the Vietnamese, but they came out losing, and I think that they can lose again.
Another round of questions if there are any more.
19 jailbreak, 1983 with GY and Co. So okay, so that's my record. So then you see that two of us are on different sides, and it's not because I was not in the academic institution. Okay, so we make different choices in this world in terms, and I'm saying that, and this was the point. I'm not saying that they should give solidarity to the PhDs who are signing agreements for our oil and things to be taken out. I'm saying that it's precisely because the West is on the side of those forces who were locking us in military cells. That's why those forces are strong. It's not because those of us who have made the other choice in life do not exist. And that's the way I brought in solidarity.
There are some more questions.
I was just going to come back on that directly. I mean, you're pointing to the specificity of the situation. You're quite right to point out this is a continent. I think it should be thought in regional terms and continental terms. There is variation, but so the specificity of work, and clearly, the ignorance of that specificity is manifold in terms of when the West goes in. They don't know what they're going into. They don't know what they can find. They had the same thing in the Middle East. They don't know what they're dealing with. They don't know the regional peculiarities and so on, so they have strategic problems as well. But what I would also say, when there are, the totality of specific regional issues does have generalities to it. So, if you are a country, a state in Africa, sitting on billions of dollars worth of oil, or uranium, or gold, or whatever it is, and you are the ruler, you run that society, actually, for all the regional specificity, for all the cultural differences in your society, the issue of making profit out of extracting resources by exploiting workers is a generality of that. And in terms of economic, you talk about contracts and so on. Contracts are always the solidification of the balance of power in any relationship. They're not even contracts. For example, if you look at what China's doing with land grabs, creating economic zones in Africa, these land grabs are, a lot of that is used to create biofuels. To create biofuels, you rip up crops that would be used to feed a population and you turn it into fuel for some sports car in Europe, whatever it is. So that has a very bad negative impact on ordinary people at the bottom. It's not the the state mechanism that relies on the grain and the food, there's only a handful of them, it's the mass of those people. So again, you start to see this fission within every African state. I mean, perhaps after this you can point out any states, but this isn't a dynamic that's operating, but I can't think of it on top of my head. It's always going to be this, we need to make profit, the state structure needs to make profit, and have some relation to the imperialist states like China, and so on. That leaves the population in a very different situation, saying how are we going to feed ourselves? How are we going to educate ourselves? How do we stop being, someone mentioned China. Well, we've all heard the stories of Chinese-run mines literally shooting and killing their miners, Google and stories, and it's horrific. Clearly this is, but as recent footage in South Africa has shown, African police forces, military, shoot African people. So there's a generality in there as well. So I think we need to separate these two things out, the state mechanism above with all its peculiarities, and the people who have very, very distinct interests in that regard.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Hands up for the last round of questions. I know the lady...
The forces organizing at the bottom are not impoverished of any talents or areas of expertise which the top people have. That is why I'm saying that the involvement is there. It is how to tilt the balance. The balance. In fact, when my brother started speaking from Ghana, maybe he didn't know Ghana, that I also have an experience in Ghana. But when I answered the question, you see, he immediately saw that. Then he has to look at it different. That the forces which are operating from the bottom are also as determined and also have everything that it takes to run affairs. So how do we ensure that the way in which the external forces prop up the Mobutus against the patriotic forces, how do we tilt that balance? So it is hard to tilt that balance, which is more the issue than whether there is solution from below.
Well, I'd just say, I'd say really, the people of Africa are going to have to find a way to organise themselves against their governments and against the interference of the West, like they attempted to do actually in their era of independence, which they thought would bring them the benefits of democracy and Western development and so on, and clearly has failed them in that sense. So they will have to find ways to organise it, and they will be complicated. But as Expo's book, which he can talk to you about at the end, Africa Rising, is it the...
Yes, Emerging Revolution. Well, we can have a chatting for during the break. But
the point he's making is that there was resistance, there were popular movements, there were uprisings. And there is. But, and this is the problem, if the West had stayed out of Africa in the 1960s, I'm pretty sure that Lumumba, and his popular government would have lasted longer than they did. They might have even had a more radical government within a few years. If that process of upsurge from below continued, you might have seen generally popular governments emerging. But the West came in with their CIA and their assassination plots to crush that. Now we've got a situation where there's the potential for mass uprising in Africa, but to organise yourselves when the airstrikes are raining down, as we've seen in Libya and elsewhere, is nigh on impossible. So I think, yes, there's the work to be done in terms of how do Africans come up with their own strategies, which of course, they're going to have to do themselves, because we can't, dictate what they do, and we don't even understand a lot of this situation. But what we can do in this country, if we're not in that milieu, if we're not organising on the ground like Expo fortunately is, but if we're not, we should organise to incapacitate the ability of our governments, our Western governments, to rain the bombs down into Africa by rebuilding an anti-war movement that takes this head-on, the relationship between the war on terror and Africa, which I think, I don't know if Chris Nang is still here, but someone should announce the date of the anti-drones demonstration that's happening in Lincolnshire.
27th of April.
Yeah.
Lincoln.
In Lincoln, 27th of April, a demonstration against a drone base there, because those drones are being used to bomb the people who are trying to organise resistance in their own countries in Africa. So we have to be thinking as a priority, how do we rebuild the anti-war movement? How do we integrate the new African phase of the war on terror into that strategy? And also, how do we relate in terms of solidarity to a genuine popular uprising in Africa that has the potential to fundamentally transform the region?
We'll continue the chat during the break. So, I'm here. Yes.
Okay, right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.
I don't think that Mandela's death at this point will make a lot of difference to the political development in South Africa. I think there's been a transition to a post-Mandela government. I think that government is stable or unstable according to the balance of forces in South African society itself, not really whether or not it still sort of wears the mantle of Mandela. So I think that's is a negligible element actually now in contemporary politics in South Africa. I guess the only thing I'd say about, as you see, that film was made in 2007. I would say that the events since then have perhaps rather more forcefully than I thought borne out the kind of point I was trying to make at the conclusion of the film, which is that there is no complete liberation until there is control over the economic process of society. That what was being attempted by dismantling apartheid was a transition to capitalism with a black face, if you like. And I think the most recent shooting of the miners by that state's police, by the post-apartheid state's police on behalf of a mining corporation. I mean, to be honest, if I'd invented such an example to fit the thesis of the film, I couldn't have imagined it as brutal and as complete an example of that situation as the events of recent months have been.
So how does South Africa's people get to a position where they have this economic and political power? It doesn't have to be a question, it could be a point or...
Africa in 2008, and I guess my question for you is, do you think that countries such as South Africa will ever be sort of able to have more of an equality-based, sort of regime under global capitalism, without global capitalism more or less being toppled? And then secondly, with South Africa, is that I've never seen white people act as badly as I've seen them act in South Africa. Even still, I mean, in 2008, the racism there is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, I've grown up in the United States where racism is pretty serious as well. But even so, even if global capitalism, let's say, were to go away, or that whatever it is that's keeping them from reaching equality were to go away, what do you do about the residues left over from apartheid? I mean, this seems to be 20, 30 years later, and these things are still just as potent, I feel, as they were probably back before apartheid was, demolished.
Do you want to come up on those three, and then I've got a couple more hands.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with the points that you were making. I'm sure. I mean, even I know that there was much more left out of that film than was in it, and I'm sure if you lived through it, you realise there was even more left out than I could get into 20 minutes. But I think what you're saying and my basic analysis are pretty much the same thing about this. I think the only part I'd like really, I mean, you should be up here actually. You should be here. But I think you've made the point that I would like to have made in response to your point. I think that would be my answer as well. The only thing that I'd like to add really is that inside every struggle, and especially every every struggle of the scale of the South African struggle against apartheid, decades long, millions of people involved, huge sacrifice. Any struggle of that scale, it has certain turning points where what that huge energy could achieve is decided, whether it will achieve more or whether it will achieve less. It rarely achieves nothing, and we should not lose sight of the fact that the dismantlement of apartheid is a considerable something. And for me, that moment was in the 1980s. You see, there did arise within the struggle from the trade union side, from FOSATU, the Federation of South African Trade Unions, and then COSATU, a vision of what the South African Revolution would be like. And their vision, based on the union struggles, was that it would be a revolution that did away with both capitalism and apartheid at the same time. And there was a huge clash, because the ANC position had always been that there was going to be a dismantlement of apartheid, but not a simultaneous challenging of capitalism. And that debate took place on a massive scale within inside the South African movement. And I think, regrettably, what were called the workerists, the people from the unions, lost that argument. And they lost it, I think, because even though they were right about what the revolution should achieve, the ANC and the South African Communist Party within it had a broader strategy, and they could answer some questions about state power, about how to deal with the state, that the workerists on their own didn't have an answer for. The workers' point was that the workers must be represented, and there must be economic equality at the end of the day. But they didn't have a strategic conception about how that should be built in to the process of beating apartheid. And that allowed the space for the people who wanted to get to capitalism with a black face, and some people in the corporations wanted to get there. Anglo-Americans' executive board wanted to get there. It thought that apartheid was a waste of money, was a destructive system which was stopping them operating in the most efficient way as a capitalist corporation. Some of those people wanted to get there. A minority of whites, but a minority in big business wanted to get there. And the ANC leadership, for their own completely different reasons and with a completely different history and so forth, wanted to get there. The defeat of the workerists, their inability to think through another strategic possibility for the revolution, enabled that outcome to happen, enabled that bittersweet outcome, that the black bourgeoisie to come to power. And the reason why this is so important is that this debate happens in every big revolution. It is happening right now in Egypt. Right now in Egypt, there is a revolution taking place, and the question is, will there be, as the Egyptians themselves call it, a kind of second revolution, i.e. another revolution after the one that overthrew Mubarak, which will put same kind of people, the Mahalas, the textile workers, the tax collectors union, the new union federations, will they have a political program, or will power end up in the hands of the Morsi presidency, or there are the religion isn't the question here, there's plenty of secular Morsis around in the Egyptian system as well. Hamdan Musa, who's part of the National Salvation Army. But, for all the differences, the same problem is being confronted. And the problem is this: how deep will the revolution run? How deep will the change go? Will it simply be, which is not a negligible thing, it's not a small thing, will it simply be more democracy, where there was none before? That's a big thing in itself. Or will it be more democracy and real popular power and real control of the wealth? Will it be democratically elected capitalists at the head of the system and still 40% of Egyptians on $2 a day? Or will it be the kind of system that gets rid of 40 million Egyptians on $2 a day? That's the question.
Chris, and then both of you go.
Concentrate so much on the media because I think in a kind of authoritarian state system, what the media does is, well, it's pretty straightforward. Really. It does what the government tells it to do. So I mean it plays its role, but it's not as if it's a question that needs sort of analysis in quite the same way as it does in a formally democratic system, where a lot more of controlling the population's mind devolves onto the media as a manipulator of public opinion and so forth. So perhaps for that reason I didn't. And as I say, you've got a 23-minute gap here, so there's a lot you're going to there's a lot you're gonna leave out more than you put in, and you hope to really be able to put the main landmarks and so that people can locate things. I think you're absolutely right, and I agree with the analysis about the way in which capitalism affected it. I tried to point out that with the sort of slowing growth rates graph as South African capitalism actually in its apartheid form begins to hit the buffers, and therefore people begin to think, even the capitalists begin to think, whoa, there's got to be a different regime of capital accumulation here. I've written elsewhere in the book I did on imperialism, there's some material there on South Africa. What I say there and what I didn't say in the film is that South African capitalism was one of the most nationalised, closed capitalist economies, almost to the degree that East European economies were closed. 97% of capital formation in South Africa in the 50s and 60s was from South Africa, and therefore it was a closed economy. And one of the things that caused the crisis is the capitalists couldn't import cheaper raw materials and cheaper capital into the system as a globalized, liberalized economy could, and that was forcing them towards the conclusion that, you know, apartheid required a nationalized, closed economy. If the price of opening up the economy was getting rid of apartheid, they were willing to go there. That's the point, really, about that. None of which is to diminish the struggle, by the way. Societies can go on like this for a very long time unless there's a revolt from below which actually blows the whole thing open. So that isn't and shouldn't be seen as diminishing in any role the sacrifice that was necessary to actually overthrow the system. The point about racism, which I didn't properly answer it from Caitlin's question, and you re-raised it. The point is this, really. It's rather like the situation of slavery before the American Civil War, and then the Jim Crow racist laws after it. Everybody knows the difference. There is a difference between the direct slavery of before the American Civil War and even the extreme form of racism of the Jim Crow laws. And everybody knows there is a difference between the apartheid regime and the persistence of racism in post-apartheid South Africa. There is a qualitative difference, and nobody should be in any shadow of doubt that these are two different things. But the truth of the matter is, in both cases, so long as you have a system in which a tiny wealthy minority exploit the majority of people's labour, they will find ways of dividing that workforce, and racism will always be one of them. So the persistence of capitalism is the persistence of racial division. And one of the things that's lost by not challenging capitalism as a system is the ability not to challenge racism, as well as to get rid of its institutionalized, most brutal forms, either be they slavery or apartheid.
I've got a gentleman here, and then I've got two people that want to speak again. I just want to check that I'm not missing anyone around the corner that had their hand up. Okay.
These are really fundamental points, and I think it's always very important to make real distinctions where they exist. The apartheid regime, I said in the film, and it is not an exaggeration to say that the South African regime was the most complete form of racial discrimination of any regime since the Nazis, and the attempt to the kind of fake scientific division of the population into racial groups. That's exactly what the Nazis did, and it's the only other regime that's really attempted to do that. So the abolition of that regime is progress, full stop. No matter what comes after it, no matter what the difficulties and inequalities are, which I agree both of the points that you've been making and you've been making about the continuities there, but the important point is to get both what has changed and what has not changed in the right framework. Because for this reason, because in my belief, the most important legacy of the apartheid era is the struggle against it, is what people did, is their sense that they could change the society around them. And if there's one thing that can help to make a second revolution in South Africa, which can deal with all those things that are, the continuance of racism, the continuance of poverty, the continuance of ownership of capital in a tiny number of hands. If there's one thing that can contribute more than anything else to that, it is the memory of what was done to overthrow apartheid. Because the same processes, the same kind of activities will be necessary against the new regime, against the new problems, against the new enemy. So that memory of what was done and what was achieved, and not belittling how much was achieved, even while we remember how much is still to be done, is very, very important. It was Steve Biko saying that the most powerful weapon in the hand of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed, and the notion of freeing the mind of the oppressed from the oppressor is the notion of what you achieved in the past, of what popular struggle, what working class struggle achieved in the past, and the necessity of deploying those kind of methods for change in the future. On your question about were the ANC overwhelmed, no, I don't think that's the question. I don't think that's the issue. I don't think they were suddenly overwhelmed by the people's demands. The magnificent thing about the internal history of the South African struggle is that these options were consciously debated. Nobody was overwhelmed, nobody was surprised. Nobody thought this wasn't going to happen. They consciously debated what was going to be the outcome of this kind of revolution. And on the one hand, you had people who said, no, we want the whole lot to go. We want apartheid to go, but we want the system of exploitation of capitalism to go with it. That's what the workers said. I mean, you lived through it, but I mean, I knew the people who argued that. Moses Maikiso and the people who led the Mine Workers Union, the people who led the Metal Workers Union, they started off with that position. That was their critique of the ANC. They said to the ANC, in effect, you people just want to get rid of apartheid, you'll end up with a new series of bosses, this isn't good enough for the workers in the unions. That was their position. Their weakness was they didn't have an alternative political strategy, and so in the end, they became co-opted into the ANC strategy in the end of the day. And the ANC strategy, from the Freedom Charter onwards, in the 1950s, was quite consciously, we want a democratic society without apartheid, and then after that, we'll address the question of capitalism. So the brilliance of the South African movement, which shows what a high political level it was at, was that these alternatives were quite consciously debated. And in my view, the wrong alternative was taken. Not that it didn't achieve a great deal in abolishing apartheid, but it didn't achieve as much as could have been achieved by the level of mobilisation and the level of consciousness in South Africa in the course of the battle. And that's the lesson to carry on into Egypt, to what's happening in Tunisia now. Same process going on in Tunisia now. And I guess the final thing to draw out of that is that those debates, exactly those debates, took place in meetings like this. People sorted out this kind of thing in political meetings where they referred back to the history of previous revolutions, where they looked at what had happened in the Russian Revolution or the Great French Revolution, where they learned about the history of past struggles. In political meetings like this, they debated before it became, and this is exactly the point, before it became the decisive point for the whole society was going to go one way or another. They tried to sort out what was necessary and what should be required, how we should fight and what we should fight for. And therefore, I guess my final point is, this isn't just about the past. This is about our present now. This is about what we decide to do about privatisation, about the destruction of the health service, about globalisation, about what we do about the unions and rebuilding them in this country. It's about what we do now. So if you want the best thing to draw from the history of the South African struggle is that you need to be involved in those debates now, because your future is being decided in the society around you. You can either be part of it or you can let it happen to you. And you